Hello, hello. Welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator from Gibson's Bookstore, and I am very pleased to welcome an author joining us virtually tonight, Tanya Hester. She is the author of Wallet Activism: How to Use Every Dollar You Spend, Earn, and Save as a Force for Change. Tanya, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
To our audience members, Wallet Activism is available from Gibson's Bookstore. We happily offer in-store shopping, curbside pickup, online shopping. We ship, we do international shipping. We are happy to get this book into your hands, especially because the message of this book, Wallet Activism, shop local, which is our rallying cry all year round, is a branch of Wallet Activism. If you are an audience member joining us tonight, please, throughout the event, we're happy to take questions throughout the event. Please tuck your questions into the chat sidebar or the Q&A box. We will be answering them throughout the event. With that in mind, Tanya, please tell me a little bit about Wallet Activism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to echo that. I think Q&A is the most fun for me, most fun for you, because I can answer your specific questions. So please don't hesitate to throw questions in there. Wallet Activism is definitely a book that I feel so fortunate to have gotten to write, because it's really about using your financial power in all its forms to push back against unjust status quos. So that could be whether, an environmental status quo, it could be a social injustice related to inequality or exploitation of humans. And I think that a lot of us really want this. We know from research, and I think many of us know anecdotally, that there's tremendous interest in being able to use our financial power for good. But unfortunately, a lot of that conversation usually gets stuck in shopping, sort of in the ethical consumerism or conscious consumerism realms. And that's a positive first step, but it's still ultimately consumerism when we talk about it that way. It's still saying that all of our power is from shopping only. It says that the point is to consume, and it sort of assumes that, well, okay, maybe it's bad to buy this thing, but you could just buy this thing instead, when in fact, that's generally not the solution that we need to find. And so I wanted to both broaden that conversation to talk about all the parts of your life where you have financial power, like where you save and invest your money, how you donate your money, how you generate an income and conduct yourself in the office, how you travel, where you choose to work, the food you eat. All of that stuff goes into Wallet Activism. And so I wanted to be able to broaden that conversation and also remind us that a lot of the time the best answer is just not to consume, and to give you a system. One of the things that had been frustrating to me and that motivated me to write the book was that the resources that were out there often took an overly simplified view of the problems facing us, and likewise, an overly simplified view of the solutions. And I think we all can relate to the fact that we've been recycling for 30 years now, and we haven't solved our plastic problem. We haven't solved the landfill problem. We haven't solved plastic in the oceans or just trash in the oceans generally. We haven't solved, the fact that we have to keep bringing new resources out of the earth to create all the new materials we're making. And so while it's a good thing to recycle, and it sounds nice to talk about it, it's not by itself kind of the solution that we need. And so ultimately I felt that those resources didn't really trust the reader and didn't trust me as a reader when I was reading it, but you also, in being able to accept the full state of things and to talk about a lot of the really harsh bad news that's out there about the state of the climate, the state of other people, the fact that so many of our lifestyle habits rely on the exploitation of people who are lower income than us, or maybe have fewer rights, period. A lot of the stuff that we buy is made with forced labor of both adults and children. And I really believed that we could handle that, readers wanted the full truth. And sometimes that would be messy and complicated, but I feel like readers want that and want to be spoken to like adults. So that was an important part of it. But then the flip side is, if you just make it complicated, then it gets really discouraging very quickly. And so I also wanted to find a way to give you really actionable solutions. So I've created a simplified decision-making process for thinking through any financial decision, not just purchasing decisions, but all of them, to think about, what is the money that you're using going to fund? What kind of a world is that helping to create? Is the thing too cheap? And that tells you that it was absolutely produced with exploitation of people and Earth's resources, things like that, so that it's a lot of information, but also gives you a simplified way to think about it. And it's all really guided by your values. So we go through an exercise early on where we talk about the values that you care most about, the issues that you care most about, so that you can help prioritize the steps you take, because no one can do everything that's in the book. And that's not the point. The point isn't to do it all or to be perfect. It's to create a philosophy for yourself that will help you move through the world in a way where you can push back against the status quo when it's unjust, and you can also feel really good about the decisions you're making. And so with that, I'd love to maybe just chat a bit more. Again, if y'all have questions, please throw them in the chat. Otherwise, maybe Elizabeth, we can talk a bit more and hear maybe your questions.
Sure. So your intro gave me so many more questions and so many more things that I want to talk about. My parents were fairly counterculture hippies, so I was probably like the first one in my year of graduation who was like already recycling, and I'm like, I can show you how to do that. Like, I know how to do so many things, but I'm always also still learning. And you don't have, like you said, you don't have to do all of them. Progress is made not by like a couple people being perfect, but by everybody making small changes. Like, even if it's just, bringing Tupperware instead of like plastic baggies that you're just going to throw out. That's a small change. Or people bringing like their silicone straws instead of like the plastic straws. That has wide reaching environmental impacts, not quite like as widely publicized as people thought it was going to be, but or it was publicized to be this save the turtles with the straws, but like it still counts. It's still like these small steps. And I wanted to ask you if you had some examples, if you could tell me about any instances where wallet activism did bring about change.
There are so many, and something that I think is really helpful to remember is that when we're talking about a lot of the change that needs to happen, it can only happen at the policy level. And this is definitely not a book that's going to argue that wallet activism can fix everything. We need government intervention in a lot of things. We need policymakers to step up and decide to fix problems that we've created. We need to hold corporations accountable on a large scale way and create more incentives for them not to do bad things. But we still have a lot of power. And something that I think is helpful to think about is that when you're talking about politics, which is the field I worked in for a lot of years, you have an election and you have to get 51% of the vote in order to win, which is a big share of people. And oftentimes, just to get policies passed, it needs to have popular support when they do polls of, all Americans or something like that, where you need to show that the majority of people want something in order for it to happen. And even then, it sometimes doesn't. When we're talking about capitalism and profits and shareholder dividends and things like that, the bar actually becomes much, much lower. Because if you think about a big company, if their profits drop 3%, it sounds like a small percent, but that's something they notice. It's something that the company notices. It's something the board members notice. It's something that the shareholders in the company, if it's publicly traded, they notice, and they're going to say, hey, where are our profits? What's happening? And they're going to want to know what's causing them to lose this business or market share or profit. And so when we think about wallet activism, it's important to remember that we actually can make change, even if we only have 3%, 5% of people significantly changing their ways. That can be enough to send a strong signal. And of course, that's assuming we don't do other things, which are very possible, like boycotts or media campaigns to try to push companies to change their ways, or again, working through policy means to create punishment for companies who don't do the right thing. We need to do all of that stuff to help a lot of the problems that we're facing. But I love to use examples that are actually not the ones folks think of, because there have been plenty of cases of consumer boycotts forcing a company to change its ways. Nike is a big example of that, where consumer boycotts really, really pushed that company to change a lot about its practice. But I like some of the workplace type examples, because work is very much a financial transaction. You're trading your time and expertise for money from a company. They are buying something from you, your service. And so that is because it's a financial transaction, an opportunity for you to flex some financial power, even if it doesn't feel very great. So my favorite recent example is Hachette Book Group, which is one of the largest publishers in the world. They were set to publish Woody Allen's memoir last year. And I'm sure folks know, but he has been credibly accused by his stepdaughter of molesting her when she was a little kid. And a lot of people, for that reason, did not want to see his memoir published. And folks were protesting, like customers were speaking up to Hachette, folks online were shouting at them. There was a lot going on with people trying to pressure Hachette to shut down that publication. And none of that worked. But then a group of junior level employees, these were not executives or senior level folks, but like assistants, folks in the mailroom, to the entry level jobs, a group of those folks staged a walkout and walked out of the office, got media coverage, and they successfully got Hachette to change course and to stop publication of the book. And so like, that's one book. And as it turned out, another fringier publisher picked it up. So it still got published in the end. But I think it's just the simplest to explain and to show that that was a collective action where nobody in that group was sticking their neck out and risking getting fired as an individual. But it was also because it was such junior people who skewed things that I think that's a good reminder. It feels like we have to be rich or we have to have a lot of power in our job in order to make change. And it's just really not true. And sometimes banding together with others can be the best strategy.
I do remember that. And I had forgotten about that. And it was incredibly inspiring because it is hard to get a job in publishing. It is hard to get one. There's not a lot of room for growth. They risked a lot to do this. And I remember being so proud of them doing that. They did walk out and they did risk their jobs, and they did so very publicly, and it worked, and everybody was very proud. Audience members, please tell us in the chat, what are some causes that you believe in that you'd like to influence? Someone here says women's rights and corporate greed. Capitalism is destroying everything, and so many people are brainwashed to believe it's okay. I agree, even as I sit here working for a retail store. I do agree. I can give an example from my own life. Some members of my family have food intolerances, and 15 years ago, we had maybe one or two safe products on the shelves that you could reach for that were like dairy free or gluten free or egg free. And now there's whole sections in the store, and there's not like a dairy free nonprofit putting out products saying we're doing this out of the goodness of our heart. They're doing this because consumers are willing to spend money on this, or on ethical products. People are willing to spend their money on ethical products and are skipping the less ethical products, and money talks. Tanya, can you think of any examples of wallet activism for women's rights? I mean, I think donations and investing your donations might be a prime example of this.
There are a ton of examples, and honestly, most of the stuff that I talk about in the book can cover just about any issue, and you might just choose to use your financial power differently depending on what you care about. So for example, if your big focus is the climate crisis and averting that, you might take a very different path than someone who's really focused on reversing the racial wealth gap. It might be that, those who are climate focused choose to consume as little as possible because you just don't want to burn through any resources in the planet, while those who are trying to reverse the racial wealth gap are focused on spending money at Black-owned businesses owned by other people of color. And those are going to look like two very different paths. So I think knowing that any of this stuff can fit is really good. One of the things that I talk about in the book is about trying to think with a justice lens instead of just a sort of like cheering for some particular cause, that we're trying to right injustices. And so with women's rights in particular, something that I think about pretty frequently, and I write about this briefly in the book, is that it's very popular right now to focus on giving business to companies that have a woman CEO or that do something in some way to cater to women. And that's not necessarily bad at all. That can be really good. We certainly need more women CEOs. But We also have some companies that have been women run, but then have treated their downline employees, the folks with much less power and financial privilege, have treated them very badly. And it's not really looking at things from a justice perspective if we don't pay attention to the lowest earners and those with the least power. So I argue, for example, that like just trying to promote a woman to CEO of a big company is fine, but it's actually better and affects more people if we focus on raising the wages of the frontline workers, the folks in the factories, the folks working at the counter, the ones actually doing the thing that makes that CEO, have a job. And we so often focus on like the people already close to the top rather than looking at those with the least power. So that's something that I recommend we focus on in our actions. Nobody's going to be perfect in this. And, again, fighting for more CEOs or women in leadership, all of that's positive. But you might just sort of think about how you can also support the folks at sort of the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy. Just looking at some of these other questions, let's see, how can someone on a smaller household budget make better choices in food, supplies, etc., when the good stuff is more expensive or the better stores are more expensive? Target
That
versus
kind of what you just said kind of feeds into that, because maybe you do choose something that fits your budget, but among those choices, you can choose a company that to have ethical practices regarding their workers or sourcing their products.
Yes. And I think too, I want to reassure folks, like the folks who are lower earners, the good news is that folks who have less money to spend are much less of the problem. Many of the problems that we have are because of the overconsumption and the exploitation that necessitates of those with higher incomes. And so we're really talking about people who are a bit wealthier having the biggest responsibility to change their ways. Folks who are lower income, you bear much less of that responsibility. And so I think that that's at least sort of a positive way to think about it. But there are things you can do. I talk about, and it's funny because we're coming up on Black Fridays later this week. I talk about, if you can, avoiding shopping at peak periods has a big impact. And we know from research that's been done that, for example, workers at Amazon's fulfillment centers have much, much higher injury rates. They're denied bathroom breaks. They're not given meal breaks, all these things that are bad in really busy times. So that's like Black Friday through Cyber Monday, kind of the whole holiday season, Prime Day, their invented shopping holiday, all that stuff. And the same patterns appear to bear out at some of the big retailers, that when it's busier, people are under more pressure to stay at the cash register longer, stay on their feet, all the things that lead to some bad outcomes. And so just by shifting your shopping a week or two earlier or later, you can often make a big difference. It's similar where if you're ordering flowers for Mother's Day, most of the year, flowers come into America. Most of the flowers that we buy, the biggest share comes from the Netherlands, but the second biggest share comes from South America now. And that's because of some US policy to incentivize other crop growing in the countries that used to grow more drugs. And so it was a DEA incentive program. And so Ecuador and Colombia now produce a huge share of our cut flowers, but they typically come in commercial aircraft. They go in the excess space available. And so it's actually not a big problem that they travel a long distance because they're not taking up a whole plane. But then during the peak periods like Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, they're chartering whole aircraft to fly the flowers to Miami, and that's where the customs process happens. And then they get put on planes or trucks to go around the country. And so buying flowers that have been shipped in then, they have a very, very different environmental impact than roses you might buy in the middle of the summer or in the middle of the winter. So thinking about avoiding peak periods is something that anyone can do at any budget level. There's also just the idea of consuming less generally. So if you are really scraping by and everything you buy is a necessity, please don't stress about that. But I think that most people who have just a little bit of flexibility in the budget still buy things that we don't need or won't use for long, just because we live in such a consumer-driven society and there's all this pressure on us, like giving us this feeling that buying something is going to be the answer to whatever we're upset about. I don't think it's by accident that right now, during the pandemic, while people are very stressed out, we also see this massive spike in consumption, and that we keep talking about it as the supply chain issue, but it's mostly a problem because people are consuming at a really high level right now. And so, yes, there are ships parked offshore waiting to get unloaded, but we're also buying a lot more stuff than we usually do. And so if we can sort of recognize that and recognize, okay, some of this stuff I do need, or it will truly make my life better and that has value. This other stuff is just me being stressed out about modern life or, climate doom, and I'm trying to practice some retail therapy. If you can cut a lot of that out, one, it's good for your own finances because, it's good for all of us not to spend money we don't need to spend. But two, it really does help reduce that reliance that we have on exploited labor and all of the different environmental consequences that go into making things, shipping them across the ocean, all of that stuff.
Something that I really want to talk about is fashion. The fashion industry. This past year, I've gotten into something called slow fashion, which is literally the opposite of fast fashion, clothes that are produced very cheaply and very quickly, and they maybe last a season, or they're very thin, or they fall apart, or they're not really meant for you to wear many times, either because fashion moves on or because they're just so poorly made. I was horrified to discover that fashion is apparently one of the largest polluters in the world, both because of the cost of water or the agriculture, but also just like the factories, the human rights and forced labor issues in countries, but also just the amount of clothes that, like, we put them in the donation bins and we think that they're helping. And what they're doing instead is that the countries that they're sent to don't really want our clothes because they're so poorly made, or they're just piling up in landfills in other countries, which was really upsetting to learn. But so many of the slow fashion or high quality or organic cotton, they're like, this dress is $190, and that's not within reach of almost anybody that I talk to regularly who's looking to slowly replace their wardrobe with more sustainable things. I can't afford to just buy $190 linen shift. Like that's not something that is very feasible. So one of the things that I've been learning from it is that it is better. You don't have to buy the high-end stuff. You don't necessarily, if you can buy from an ethical company, that's wonderful. But one of the best things you can do is just not buy things and like repair, sew a button back on, or, mend something or re-dye. I discovered apparently that they make packets of denim dye that you can just re-dye your jeans if they're all bleached out. So there are companies out there though, like I think it's called Sheen or Shine, or it's a company, it's basically the fast fashion king right now. And the reason that they're profitable is because of the sheer amount that they produce. So by not buying from it, they're being forced to slow down and stop. We have questions here. What are good places to donate to? For example, isn't Salvation Army not a great choice? There are political reasons you might not donate to certain companies, but specifically the one that I was referring to, there are companies that bundle up your clothes and they sell them by the pound, basically, to third world countries. I believe that also destabilizes the local economies because the local garment makers cannot compete with that. So you're actually destabilizing countries, the garment industries in the countries that they're donated to. I'm not really certain. Can you think of good off the top of your head? I'm sure that you're deeply involved in the fast fashion donation community, Tanya. But can you think off the top of your head any good places to donate to? And locally, I think Friends of Forgotten Children is good. Local food pantries usually have their finger on what is needed locally.
And I can't speak to locally since I'm not local there. You actually said a number of things that I'd love to speak to a bit more, because I think it's actually helpful to kind of reframe our thoughts on this stuff. So you said you described some clothing as poorly made. What I would actually love for us to do, and this is not my original idea, but when clothes are cheap, when anything is cheap, we value it less than when it costs more, and we treat it badly and we don't take care of it. And I think that we forget the role we have to play, where if you buy a shirt for $8, you're probably going to treat it worse than a shirt you bought for $50. And so I think that we need to kind of own that piece of it and do a better job taking care of what we already own. I think the point about the expense of the slow fashion products really highlights, I think, some elitism that we haven't quite acknowledged in a lot of the environmental movement and a lot of the minimalist sort of focused movements, that they always tend to have an aesthetic. You've got to have like this capsule wardrobe that includes these pieces. And that means
which are certainly not appropriate for a manual labor job or no, they're going to get shredded. They're going to get wrecked, dry clean only somehow.
Yeah. And so like, we don't talk enough. So it's like, okay, you care about the environment. Well, you need to buy an electric vehicle. You care about not having too much waste at the store. You need to buy your stainless steel water bottle so that you aren't using plastic water bottles. Instead of that, we could say, how about I try to get as much use as possible out of the things I already own? And any bottle you already own has a much smaller environmental impact than a newly produced stainless steel water bottle. Any clothing you already own, even, most of our clothes are now made almost completely of plastic. They're not really made of natural fibers unless you specifically seek that out. And I've just been trying to find a cotton dress lately, and it is so hard. It's almost impossible to find in many instances, especially if you aren't going to pay a fortune for it. And so just doing your best to get all the use possible out of what you already own is really good. Elizabeth talked about some of the main issues with the way that we donate and discard, that in addition to a lot of what we donate ending up in developing nations who now have this mountain of clothing to deal with, like there's a huge mountain of clothes sitting in the Atacama Desert in Chile. Several West African nations have had their entire textile industry decimated, basically because all of this unwanted clothing came in from Western, wealthy countries. But in addition, and I think probably something that's maybe more immediately upsetting, is that no matter where you donate, on average, about 3/4 of what is donated goes to the landfill. It's never sold. And so I think that we think of donations, and I'll talk about money donations in a moment, but I think we tend to think of stuff donations as, I'm doing this really nice thing. Isn't it great? Someone else is going to get use out of it. And it gives us an excuse to get rid of a lot of stuff at once instead of trying a little bit harder and being more deliberate and finding a home for things. But the reality is, most of the time, all you're doing is you're passing the buck to somebody else to do the throwing away, because they just don't have the time or capacity to try to find a home for every single item. Plus, a ton of people donate stuff that's in bad shape, isn't really sellable. But even if you donate pristine things, a lot of it's still going to end up in the trash. And so I think that when we think about donating that way and know where stuff is really going, we're much less likely to willy-nilly put stuff in a trash bag and take it to Goodwill or wherever else. And so I really think that we need to focus more on finding specific homes. So if it's joining a buy nothing group and doing more exchanges, if it's hosting a garage sale and just trying to get people to actually buy stuff, knowing that if they pay for something, they're going to value it more than if they get it for free. And so even if it's a $2 garment at a garage sale, that's still likely going to get used more than if you give it away. So those are important things to think about. In terms of cash giving, I think this is very much an area where it's important to just reflect on your own values and the things that are important. Certainly, a lot of folks have issues with the practices that Salvation Army practices. I don't donate to them personally because they have kind of religious requirements for those who get services from them. It's likewise, a lot of the organizations that provide homeless services have requirements about sobriety and different rules that are very restrictive and not fair to people. And so you may choose, if you decide that that's an important issue to you, to seek out organizations that don't have that requirement. And I think in that case, it's just best to look local, look at who's working in your community. They can also be organizations that serve people experiencing homelessness can also be really good sources to ask them, is there a better place to donate stuff locally? And often they'll have unpublicized thrift stores, or if you donate it directly to a shelter, they might be able to use more of it than if you donate it to a place that's trying to sell it. So those are some other things you can think about. But I have a whole chapter on philanthropy in the book, and I just really recommend that folks donate as much as you can. You know, we've really shifted the conversation in charitable giving to be away from here are organizations doing important work, which we should be funding through our tax dollars, but we're not. And so they're stepping in and filling that gap, and we need to just fund them, to instead focus on these few instances of organizations that have done bad things with folks' money. And those are still incredibly rare examples. And the truth is that most people working at nonprofits work really hard. They take a lot less pay than they could easily get at another job in the private sector. And so we just need to donate. And frankly, doing no homework on it and just donating to whatever sounds good to you is better than not donating because you can't find exactly the perfect place. So that's something that I just, I think is a good way to shift your mindset and to say donating is better than not donating. Giving imperfectly is better than not giving.
To our audience members, if you have questions or topics you'd like to discuss, please feel free to put those in the chat sidebar or the Q&A panel. I really liked your comment about using what you have instead of buying the new steel water bottle. There's the cost per use equation to put into mind. If you buy a very inexpensive $30 dress that you wear once, you've paid $30 per wear. But if you buy something, it doesn't have to be expensive. If you buy a dress that you've thought about carefully and you wear it a dozen times, then that same $30 dress costs something like less than $3 per wear. And it doesn't have to be this perfect linen dress. It just has to be a thoughtful purchase. Tanya, I do want to ask you, how did you fall into this? You mentioned that you work in politics previously. How did you fall into writing a whole book about wallet activism?
This is very much sort of, I would say all the topics within it are issues that I've cared about for a long time. And I've been, frankly, a bit frustrated seeing how they're talked about, that we tend to have all these faux dichotomies about the way we talk about things. We say we can either have policy action, collective action, holding corporations accountable, or we can take individual action. And I just don't think that's an or. I think that's an and. You know, corporations are responsible for a lot of the problems in the world, but we are their customers and we are funding them. And we need to go at the problems from all sides. I think that's true of basically any problem facing us. We need to go at it through more than one angle. And that's something that I really focused on a lot in my working life, was on trying to think about different levers of change. And it was something that I really learned about through different clients. I worked for a lot of the big foundations. I worked for a huge number of nonprofit organizations, some political candidates, political ballot measures, those kinds of things. But all of it was about promoting progressive change. And sometimes it was about getting voters to do something. Other times it was the public. So I worked a lot on healthcare reform, for example, education reform, trying to just get people to even know that something was a problem. Like we tried to raise awareness about the genocide in Darfur, Sudan, and that was something people didn't know about. And so that's going to be a very different kind of campaign than, hey, vote for this guy on November 2nd. And so you really kind of see different angles working that type of job. And so I just felt that I had a lot to offer in putting these topics together to think about the things that we do that just make us feel good, but don't ultimately help anybody and sometimes do harm. Like I think discarding a lot of things, the decluttering movement has really put the focus in the wrong place and encouraged us to get rid of stuff. And then that generally tends to give us permission to then buy more stuff. And so it's ultimately feeding into that consumerist and overconsumption cycle. But I think also just, I had an interesting opportunity because my last book was very financially focused to take a financial angle to this. And that's, I think, something that people care about. People care about using their money for good, not for evil. And it feels really big and impossible. And I saw lots of folks sort of walking around the edges of the issue, but no one really diving in exactly. And I said, you know what, I've got time. I have the research skills to do this. I was a journalist before I worked in politics. And I feel like I can put this together. And so this has been about a 3-year project. We first proposed it back in spring of 2019, which, gosh, doesn't that feel like 5 lifetimes ago?
It's forever ago. It was in the before.
Yeah. And so the world was very different then. It's interesting seeing just within publishing how when we pitched it in 2019 and the start of 2020, a lot of publishers weren't interested in publishing this kind of book because they said, you know, social change books just don't sell very well. And then, of course, George
Oh,
Floyd was murdered and there were nationwide protests, I mean, worldwide protests, and people really speaking up. And suddenly the publishers were much more interested. But that sort of, the whole thing gave me a different level of motivation to talk about the book. And it feels very uncomfortable, I think, for most authors, but certainly for me to try to sell things or to say to people, hey, here's a book about not buying stuff, but would you buy it? It feels contradictory. But at the same time, I was really just sort of like motivated by all the publishers saying, we love this, but we don't think it'll sell. That to me said they were also turning down other authors, and they were turning down authors of color, authors from other marginalized identities and communities who were trying to bring important issues to the front. But I could only imagine how often they were getting rejected by publishers saying, well, this book doesn't do well. So I wanted to prove them wrong. I wanted to put a book out there and say, no, like a social issues book, an environmental issues book can do very well, so that we could pave the way for other books to be published on this, because I'd love to read a lot more. I'd love to read more social issue books that don't sugarcoat things, that don't treat me like I'm 5 years old and I can't handle bad news. And so that's really what is behind it, in addition to trying to change some of these conversations that are, you know, false dichotomies of either or when it's really and.
So you mentioned the policy change, and which is a legislative process, of course, but can wallet activism affect policy? Can you think of any times when consumers have affected policy change on a wider level?
Oh, absolutely. There are many examples, you know, thinking about, I know that healthcare is far from perfect, but the system we have now is better than the system we had 15 years ago. And many more people are insured. There's more money to help people be insured. Still a lot that needs saving, but that was very much driven, you know, the Affordable Care Act passing was very much driven by voter demand, which is fundamentally the same thing as consumer demand. And that's one instance, but you can really truly think about a lot of them. There have been, you know, any of the environmental bills that we've passed have been pushed by activists who not only were lobbying lawmakers to make changes, but were also doing things like boycotting companies or boycotting industries, which those are very much acts of wallet activism. And so I don't know that you could specifically say, well, people stopped shopping at this company and therefore this law got passed. There's nothing like that, but that's because those who've been most effective at creating change have gone at the problem from multiple angles. And so I think that's really important, but I felt like there weren't enough folks talking about the individual financial decision angle and talking about it in a realistic way, other than just sort of like, I know we all have experienced this of seeing somebody say, oh, we should do this. And you sort of go, isn't that just sort of making you feel better, not really helping anything? There was too much like that and not enough that was really based in true reality and effectiveness.
So it sounds like you've mentioned it's a multi-prong approach. So if I were to pull out my military thriller novel, basically wallet activism is cutting off the supply chain of the enemy. You're basically cutting off one of the ways that they're continuing to feed themselves. If you're cutting it out or you're putting them under siege a
Yeah,
little bit.
that is certainly part of it. So I think
Yes.
for some industries, we might say, we don't wish this to exist anymore. Therefore, I am going to refuse to keep contributing to it in a way that I have been before. It's not always possible, but we can, you know, some of the worst forces are fossil fuels. It's very, very hard to completely break up with fossil fuels, but you can make a concerted effort to do that. You can call your utility and tell them that they need to build in more clean energy into their energy generation. Things like that. I talk about that in the book. But it's also, and this is the piece that's so often missing, is that wallet activism is not just cutting off support to things. It's also creating demand for things. Anything we buy, we are creating demand for more of that thing. And so if we're buying something very cheaply made by exploited labor that was shipped across an ocean, we're signaling that we want more stuff like that. And that's a lot
Which
of that.
also puts the jobs across the ocean to produce them.
Yes, yes. Although that's nuanced, and we can talk about that in a sec if you'd like. But the other side is thinking about positive demand creation. So with this book, I've really pushed folks to buy from their local independent bookstores because so many of us want local indie bookstores to exist. We get really, really sad when one closes, but then we still buy our books on Amazon. And we need to kind of integrate those thoughts so that if you want local indie bookstores in your community, we need to fund them. We need to create demand for them. And so it's both the withholding of demand and the creation of demand that in a shopping sense, which again is just a portion of wallet activism, but that's really the way to think about it. The jobs across an ocean thing is pretty interesting because we love to decry made in China and talk about how bad that is, talk about, and there's a lot of bad, certainly sending money to China supports a really cruel anti-humanitarian regime that imprisons people, forces people into forced labor situations. The Muslim Uyghurs are, it's terrible. And Tibet, there's a lot of bad that government has done and continues to do. So that's a clear negative. On the positive side, manufacturing in China has been the biggest force humanity has ever known for lifting huge numbers of people out of poverty. A few decades ago, China was an incredibly low income country. Most people lived on about $1 a day. Now, China is considered solidly middle income, and that's wholly because of manufacturing there. And so I think it's important to look beyond sort of like the American borders and to look at around the world. Like if you care about lifting people out of poverty, people in China matter also, not just people you see when you're walking down the street in your community. And so it's an important reminder that just sort of taking like hardline stances without looking at any of the details behind it is not necessarily a good way to get to true justice. That said, if you decide you're not going to buy anything made in China, I mean, there are worse things you can decide because, again, there is so much that's negative. The workers don't have all the protections there that they have in the US. But it's just sort of to complicate it a little bit for us to recognize that a lot of the things we think of as purely bad do have a lot of good baked into them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I meant when you want to create demand for things, if you want more jobs in America, then you purchase from companies that create American jobs.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right, especially a lot of clothes made in India, it is a woman-led workforce in many of the garment industries in India. There are human rights issues there, but there are very few jobs for some of the women in India besides garment industry. So it's a complicated path that one must navigate, but the whole point of activism is that you make choices. So, and you look for as much knowledge as you can, and you make choices within those things. Absolutely. Stephanie wants to know, do you have plans for any other books in the future? We were talking before we got started that it's so nerve-wracking for a book to possibly become out of date.
Yeah. Just like after I finished writing the book, then Bill and Melinda Gates announced that they were getting divorced, and I had a portion on the Gates Foundation. I had to think about like, how do we talk about this? Because we don't actually know what's going to happen with the foundation or some of the climate stuff. I write a lot about the Paris Agreement and the IPCC report that the UN put out, but I of course don't have anything from the Glasgow COP26 meeting that just happened because that happened the week before we published. So that's just a funny thing. I have lots of thoughts of things that I would like to write about and explore in greater depth. But I don't have a concrete book idea right now that I'd like to do next. And I think a big part of that is because I'm really interested to know, like I feel very close to everything that's in the book. The book is 100,000 words of stuff that I, have like poured forth from my soul with also 500 citations. So just so you know, it's very heavily researched and grounded in reliable fact, not just my conjecture or opinion. But because I feel close to everything, I don't have the distance to know, okay, what are the things in here that people would really like to know more about? What's something where you read it and you go like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. I never knew that. Tell me more. I have no idea what those things are going to end up being. And so one of the great things that you could do for me is if you read it and find that certain things really resonate for you, send me a note on social media or email me, because I want to know that. I really want to hear from readers and hear which parts stand out the most. And I think that that could very potentially lead to the next book idea. But I want to stay really open to that. So if anyone has thoughts right now you want to put in the chat, you can. I'd love to just hear from you after you read it.
We'll crowdsource your next book. I like this idea. We'll just put us in the acknowledgements right there. It'll be great. And it's shopping local, you know, is Wallet Activism right here. I think that's about the end of it for us. If you have ideas for Tanya and you think of them afterwards, feel free to send it to us and I will pass it along to Tanya. Wallet Activism, how to use every dollar you spend, earn, and save as a force for change, is available from Gibson's Bookstore, and we are happy to ship it to you internationally. We are happy to, I'll throw your Instagram here right into the chat. Do you check your messages on Instagram?
I do. Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
If you message me there, and I'll give you my Twitter also, so that those are good ways to reach me and follow along with new stuff I'm writing.
Excellent. So Tanya's book is available for in-store pickup. You can browse us. You can pick it up at curbside. We will ship it to you. We are very happy. And I think you mentioned that about 50% of this book sales have come from indies, which is not common in the book industry anymore. That's very impressive. And that just goes to show that the people who care about shopping local are the people shopping at indie bookstores, and they care about wallet activism. And it's a wonderful full circle. It just delights me, absolutely delights me. And I will be tweeting about that from the store account about this. It's just really feeds into itself. Any final thoughts to leave us on? What's your favorite way to use wallet activism in your personal life?
Oh gosh, I think of it less as like a series of tasks and more as a process for assessing things and thinking them through. And I think once it's funny because I've jokingly said that the subtitle of the book should be called, how to unlearn all the lies that you're told, because that's really a recurring theme throughout the book, is just all the different ways that we're lied to by corporations, often even by people who seem to be on the same side, sometimes by environmentalists or by social justice advocates. And so my favorite thing is just sort of like hearing a message and thinking, okay, where's the lie? Or like, what is this person actually trying to get to? And often you get to, oh, they're trying to sell me something. That's generally the answer. Or they're trying to raise money from me, or, something like that. It's usually something in a capitalist frame, and spotting that and then thinking about, okay, what can I learn from that? And so that's less of a specific action and more of just kind of like a mindset shift. But I've dedicated half the book to that idea, to the idea of shifting your mindset, and the second half to a deeper dive on specific topics. And so I'd really love to just hear from as many of you as possible on how that's going and what your favorite things are to do. It's sort of like you might adapt your own questions beyond the ones that I give you in the book, and think about how you can use those to guide your decision making. And so all of it, I really would love to hear from folks and hear what's resonating, and hear what you're doing with the information there.
Well, for our people who will be watching us later on YouTube, Tanya's social media handles on Instagram and Twitter are our_nextlife. So our_nextlife. So that's you at Twitter and Instagram. Tanya, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
This was marvelous. Thank you for having me. And thanks for the great questions. And shout out to Stephanie for a lot of those wonderful comments.
Stephanie, you have been a trooper tonight. You've had many questions, and I love when audiences have questions. I absolutely adore it. So Stephanie is our MVP for the evening. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you to our audience members at home. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.